thank you for coming tonight. We are going to be dealing with a very crucial issue, and it's really sad that most people, they're not even aware of it, or if they are aware of it, they're so indifferent that they're not going to learn about it. What's on the slide is information about a book, The Slaughter of the Dissidents, The Shocking Truth About Killing the Careers of Darwin Doubters. Much of the information that you'll see tonight comes from this book. I would really encourage you to get a copy of the book and to just really be informed about what's happening out in society, especially the classroom, the university classroom, the high school classroom. The title of our discussion tonight, or our talk tonight, Atheism in the Public Schools. You know, if this was presented to the State Department in South Carolina, in Columbia, the State Department of Education, they would reject it without blinking an eye. In fact, maybe even vehemently. They would just totally disown the information. So the goal that I have tonight is that when the presentation is over, that you'll see very clearly that atheism plays a prominent part in our public schools and public universities and colleges. And you know that this is a really critical issue facing Christianity. We're going to deal mainly with the science classroom. But even if you, just don't look at the science classroom, just look at these Supreme Court decisions that have occurred. 62, prayer was declared unconstitutional in public schools. 63, Bible reading, unconstitutional. 1973, abortion legalized. And you might say, how does that fit in? 60 million children never got the chance to go to school. Their lives were ended in the womb. In 85, the moment of silence, unconstitutional. 86, the Louisiana Equal Time for Creation Science, declared unconstitutional. Louisiana took a stand. Their legislature passed legislation that in the biology classroom, or any classroom where origins were taught, they had to give equal time to creation science. Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. 92, prayer at graduation declared unconstitutional. 2000, invocations at football games, unconstitutional. 2005, teaching intelligent design in Dover, Pennsylvania, was declared unconstitutional. So you can see the judicial tyranny of the Supreme Court. And you could definitely come to the conclusion, boy, they're championing the issue dealing with atheism. You know, I think it's really important that we get some definitions down. We hear a lot about science. Science is a real broad term. It can encompass quite a bit. And we hear evolutionists saying evolution is settled science. Well, let's look at science. Before you can call something a science fact or factual science, this is a good definition. Knowledge of the facts gained by exact observation, experimentation, that is repeatable. If I do some research in South Carolina, it should be repeatable in North Carolina or any place else if it's going to be factual science. And this will result in ordered thinking, systematic knowledge. So when you hear the word science, another good point is like the word evolution. I remember hearing an evolutionist that was trying to prove evolution, and he was talking with him, and he said, Mr. Thorson, you don't believe in evolution? Look at the evolution of the automobile. Look at the Model T, and look at where automobiles today. And you could see the misleading statement. I told them, I said, well, that took intelligence to go from the Model T to where it's going today. It didn't happen by chance. But just even look at when you think of definitions, just think of the abortion tragedy that's going on in our country. Just think of the people that are in the abortion industry. Look at the terms they use. Pro-choice. You know, a person that doesn't think would say, well, yeah, man, choice is a good thing. I like to have choices. The mother should have control of her body. I mean, they just use terms that are misleading. And I think we need to really look at some of the definitions and have a real handle on definitions. Well, when we deal with origins, there's really basically only two options. Creation, in the beginning, God. Now, I know there's other views of creation. Other religions have different views, but we're going to be dealing with the Christian view of biblical creation, in the beginning, God. And then the second option would be the theory of evolution, which tells us time, chemicals, chance ultimately ended with mankind. Well, let's just take a look. I think it's really important that we get some basic facts down. We just talked about factual science. Let's get some basic facts down about evolution. I think to really, you leave tonight and really feel that the atheism being taught in the public schools, we just need to really have our feet on the ground and be on the same page with respect to creation. What a powerful verse here. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, a lot of times people might read that verse and gloss over it quickly. Do you know that planet Earth is part of the Milky Way galaxy? There are billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Then when the Hubble telescope came into being, they found out that there are billions of galaxies. So there are, and just to get to the nearest star, they say that if you could travel at the speed of light, that's traveling around the Earth 7 or 8 times in 1 second, 186,000 miles a second. Traveling at that speed, 24/7, it would take you 4.5 years to get to the nearest star. When you just think of just the enormity of the universe, so that verse takes on, if you just know a little bit about astronomy, it really takes on an added significance that just God just spoke everything into existence. And you know, it's faith-based. You know, creation, Genesis, it's faith-based. Here God tells us, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So there's no question. We can't take an experiment and observe the creation. It's all faith-based. But I think what's really important, God gives us some more information about creation. He didn't just leave us with that Genesis 1:1. He gave us some other information, and if we take the information that he gave us in Genesis and compare it with known factual science, you'll see that science, true factual science, and the Bible go hand in hand. Look at this verse. So God created man in his own image, male and female created he them. One of the major battles today, the gender issue, is a direct attack on God's word. God says there are 2 genders, male, female. LBGT says there's 18 different genders. And And when you look at this verse 27 too, there's another significant point, that we're created in God's image. That's not said for any other living entity, just for man. And look at what being created in the image of God is. We have moral consciousness. We can think abstractly. We have an understanding of beauty and emotions. And then we have the capacity for worshiping and loving God. Jesus affirmed the creation. You know, a lot of people try to find discrepancies between the Old and the New Testament. Jesus affirmed everything in the Old Testament. He made many references to the Old Testament. Here when the Pharisees and the Sadducees were trying to confuse him on marriage, haven't you read at the beginning? He created them male and female. You know, just to think about the human body too, when, you know, the Bible tells us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Just think of vision. Tonight, vision's a critical part of this presentation tonight. Just think of the human eye. 40 million nerve endings. The focusing muscles move an estimated 400,000 times a day. The retina contains 137 million light-sensitive cells. Even Charles Darwin said this, who's the father of evolution. To suppose the eye could have been formed by chance seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Genesis 1:21. Look at these are other facts that we get in Genesis on the creation. God created great creatures of the sea, every living and moving thing which the water teems, and they reproduced according to their kinds. Every winged bird according to its kind. It's exactly what we observe today. All species of living things reproduce according to their kind. It affirms what we know, what science has learned. And then look at this 28th verse in Genesis. Be fruitful and increase in number. One of the purposes for marriage, to be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth. And then God gives man this command to subdue the earth. And another word that could be put there is develop the earth. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. We see that. That's observable. We see man is in charge. We rule over all the other living things. We've developed the earth. Look at this picture here of a major metropolis. What a testimony to God commanding man to develop the earth, subdue the earth. Now also in his command is that we are caretakers. We shouldn't abuse. We need to take care of planet Earth. You know, the chimpanzee is considered man's closest relative. When God created the chimpanzee, he didn't create the chimpanzee in his image. He didn't give him the command to subdue or develop the earth. That habitat that you see there for the chimpanzee has not changed since the day the chimpanzees were put on planet Earth. What a testimony to observable science. Man is different. We're created in God's image. He breathed into us the breath of life. Well, let's look at that's just kind of a real quick picture of creation, what we get in the Bible. Let's look at the evolutionary theory, where God is ruled out. The evolutionary theory, really, there's two components to evolution. First of all, we need to deal with the earth, how the earth got into existence, and how the molecules and compounds and everything got into being. Our kids are taught in the public schools that there was a Big Bang theory. And this is a cosmological theory holding that the universe originated sometime between 10 and 20 billion years ago. That should raise a red flag. If I came and was selling my house and I said it's going to be between $100,000 and $200,000, we're not going to get too far with that kind of thinking. between 10 and 20 billion years ago. That should raise a red flag. By a cataclysmic explosion of matter that had been extremely compressed, high density and temperature. Again, God gave us, we're created in His image, we can think and reason. What made all the matter get so concentrated and such a high density? What caused the explosion? In fact, Stephen Hawking, he's probably in the top 3 most famous scientists in the world. At Cambridge University, here's what he's just written a book, and here's what he says. Modern physics leaves no place for God in the creation of the universe. Because there are laws such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. How can anybody... God gave us the ability to think and reason. If that statement is true, we are in trouble, serious trouble, that nothing can create something. It's really, because of the prestige Stephen Hawking has, I'm sure there's a lot of people that disagree with that, but they don't say anything. It was really kind of enlightening that a Dr. John Lennox, who's a professor of mathematics at Oxford University, he responds to Hawking's assertion that the universe can and will create itself from nothing with, "That sounds to me like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's not science." What this all goes to show is that nonsense remains nonsense even when talked by world-famous scientists. Our hats off to John Lennox. A lot of scientists said nothing when they read that. Here's another quote from a famous scientist and evolutionist, Richard Dickerson. Sometimes evolutionists, and maybe in a moment of weakness, they tell the truth. Science fundamentally is a game. It's a game with one overriding and defining rule. Let us see how far and to what extent we can explain the behavior of the physical and material universe in terms of purely physical and material causes without invoking the supernatural. Here's a magazine cover in Time magazine several years ago. What does science tell us about God? Anybody see a problem with that title? It should be, what does God tell us about science? Scientology, there's a lot of people that think ultimately science is going to find all the answers. In fact, there's even a group of people that have, at death, they have super frozen their bodies, that when man conquers death, they'll be revived. What does science tell us about God? What a message that conveys. Science is above God. And then look at Genesis, another key point when you look at the evolutionary theory. And let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and days and years. That's just what we see. The earth revolving around the sun gives us a year. Talking with Skip today, he said, boy, that tells you another thing. It debunks climate change or global warming. It marks the seasons, the days and the years. In fact, I've heard I read an article once where a person said the universe must have been created by a perfect mathematician. Everything works in such uniformity. Reading the Greenville News one day, I just happened to notice when I was checking the weather, and it had listed all the planets, and when they rise, when they first become evident here in South Carolina, and then when they set. Just think of the uniformity. Every day that's in the papers. They know when Mercury is going to appear on the horizon. And that happened as a result of an explosion, the Big Bang. I'll tell you, when you talk about faith, you have to have an awful lot of faith to come to the conclusion this was the result of a cataclysmic explosion. It was real interesting. The Bible also tells us, as this verse, as the host of the heaven can't be numbered. In fact, these three scientists In the 1500s, they counted the stars. And there were a lot of atheist scientists at that time that they criticized the Bible. They said, well, look, there's only 100 stars, only 1,000 stars. We've got them all visually pointed out. And yet when the telescopes came in, and the Hubble telescope especially, they saw that this verse was right on target. The host of heaven can't be numbered. Somebody said, give science enough time, it'll catch up with the Bible. Sir Isaac Newton, probably recognized as the most influential scientist of all time. Look at his quote: the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Okay, that's the first part of the evolutionary component. The Big Bang, that gave us all the material for evolution to occur. That's where the matter came from. That's where planet Earth came from. Now we have the theory of evolution. The first living organisms developed from non-living matter by time and chance. Then the gradual change of these living organisms from one form into another over the course of time, with the result of producing ultimately all forms of life that have ever existed on Earth, including humans. Look at the last part. Without intelligent direction or supernatural intervention. Here's a Time magazine cover again, the evolution wars. If you're a Christian, it's a war, it's a battle. It's sad where we are today. What we feel, the people in this auditorium tonight, the way we feel, we're very, very much in the minority. We're right, but we're in the minority. Look at, here's a teacher magazine. All the public school teachers, probably every public school gets this magazine. Teacher, Evolution versus Creationism. What's really, if you can read the subtitle, scientists settled the debate long ago, but for schools, the issue won't go away. There's these irritating creationists that keep on bringing up creation. Science has settled the debate long ago, but the issue won't go away. Here I was reading a science magazine, and I kept this and underlined it. Can you imagine this? Presumably, if you let molecules reshuffle themselves randomly long enough, some complex ones would get formed. And further reshuffling would make them more complex until you had something like DNA, a stable molecule that just happened to make copies of itself. If that is science, we are in serious trouble. One of the evidences that's supposed to support evolution, the theory of evolution, is fossils. Here are two prominent evolutionary scientists, and look at what they say about fossils. The process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. A knowledge of paleontology, which is the study of fossils, is therefore a prerequisite. Only paleontology can provide the evidence of evolution and reveal its course or mechanism. That was Pierre-Paul Grosset. Then you have George Gaylord Simpson. The regular absence of transitional fossils is not confined to mammals, but is an almost universal phenomenon, as has been long noted by paleontologists. It is true of almost all orders of all classes of animals. Evolution says that we started with a single cell and then multicellular cell. Finally, we got to the fish. The fish evolved into amphibians, the amphibians to reptiles. And then the reptiles went two different ways. Some reptiles became mammals and some reptiles became birds. And then we know the mammals, eventually man. Where are all the transitional forms? In fact, even our Charles Darwin was concerned. But he took the position, we'll find them. We don't have them now during his lifetime, but eventually we'll find them. Well, it's 216 and they're still missing. Here is Stephen Jay Gould. He was a professor at Harvard University, paleontologist. He's no longer with us. He died a few years ago. The extreme, in a real honest time, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. You know, fossils really prove creation. Fossils are found fully formed, just like the Bible. I mean, the fossils, most of them were formed during the flood. And there's really outstanding scientific evidence to back that up. Here's a method that's used by the evolutionists. This fossil is 70 million years old because it is in this rock that is 70 million years old. Student, and how do you know the age of the rock? The evolutionist, because it contains a 70 million year old fossil. Circular thinking, circular reasoning. This picture right here is a picture of a couple, the Nebraska man and his wife. This was in biology textbooks for a long time, probably from the 20s. I think in 1922, a paleontologist found the fossil. You know what the fossil was? A tooth. And from a tooth, this is what goes into the biology books. A man and his wife. And then they found out years later the tooth was the tooth of an extinct pig. And this was in the biology books influencing our kids. And what was sad, years after they found out that the tooth was from the extinct pig, it was still in the books for a long time. It's like Skip and I were talking about Haeckel's the embryos. When they found out that it was false information, that embryo picture showing the likeness of all the embryos, it was still in the books for many years after the fraud was discovered. You know, God gave us a mind to think, to reason, to choose. Richard Dawkins, he's probably number in the top 3 as far as well-known scientists today. He's an Oxford scientist, goes to that prestigious school in England, Oxford. We are cousins of chimpanzees, somewhat more distant cousins of monkeys, more distant cousins still of aardvarks and manatees, yet more distant cousins of bananas and turnips. He says the evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. You know, Skip said today when we were looking at this information, what an insult to Jewish people to say evolution, and what he's saying here is as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. Israel should clamp down on Richard Dawkins. Here's another quote from Richard Dawkins. It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. From Richard Dawkins. So everybody here tonight, we fall into that one of those categories according to Richard Dawkins. Here's another quote from a well-known astrophysicist. The theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact. That's being taught to our kids in the public schools. Dr. Scott Todd, Kansas State University professor in the sciences. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded because it's not naturalistic. So if all the evidence points to a creator, you got to just discard it because it's not naturalistic. Sir Arthur Keith, a British scientist, in a moment of truth, told the truth. Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. That attitude among the evolutionists is a very prominent attitude. George Wald, we've probably heard of him, Harvard University, Nobel Prize winner, wrote an article on the origin of life, wrote many articles. The reasonable view was to believe in spontaneous generation. You know, back a few years ago, people thought garbage would produce flies and rats, and Louis Pasteur and Francis Reddy, some of the great Christian scientists proved that that wasn't true, that life only came from life. Spontaneous generation was proved false. And look at what George Wald says. To believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation, that's the alternative to spontaneous generation. There is no third position. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. In fact, we have a law in science today. Kids learn it in biology. Biogenesis, life only comes from life. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. You know, when that quote was made public, Christians, there should have been a revolt. Douglas, Futima, the historical reality of evolution is not a theory, it's a fact, as fully as the fact of the Earth's revolution around the sun. Evolution began as a hypothesis, which is a scientific guess, and achieved facthood as the evidence in its favor became so strong that no knowledgeable and unbiased person could deny its reality. What do the textbooks say? Biology, the dynamics of life, a Glencoe biology book, one of the big textbook producers, Origins. By about 3.9 million years ago, the Earth might have cooled enough for the water in its atmosphere to condense. This might have led to millions of years of rainstorms with lightning enough to fill the ocean. It is in the oceans probably between 3.9 and 3.5 billion years ago, some scientists propose that the first organisms appeared. No scientist can be sure the Earth formed in this way. No. Can the scientists? No, they cannot. There is no direct evidence of the earliest years of Earth's history. How did life begin on Earth? No one will ever know for certain how life began on Earth. Differing viewpoints. But the mystery remains unsolved. That's what our kids are learning in the public schools. And that's a fact. Now that's tragic. Here's another book, Biology, the second edition, Leland Johnson. When biologists survey the vast diversity of living things, they often wonder how life originated on Earth. There's no way of knowing with certainty, but a number of ideas have been suggested. The Earth probably formed by the condensation of dust and gases approximately 4.5 to 5 billion years ago. Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, after one of his lectures, he's an avowed atheist, a student came up to him and asked him the question, Dr. Crick, say all the evidence pointed to a creator. His classic answer, I still won't believe. That's a scientist. A scientist's mind should be saying, I'm going to go where the truth is. Look at what are the key problems with evolution. Before you leave tonight, too, this is even a better explanation of problems. This 15 questions for evolutionists. Evolution hasn't answered any of these questions. If evolution was a fact, every one of these questions would be answered with empirical, testable science. Look, the origin of life from non-life, the origin of DNA. You know, when you take DNA, it's the blueprint for life. Every living thing is what they are because of the DNA. That is the blueprint. DNA can't be produced without proteins. Proteins, DNA is the blueprint for all proteins. Protein, in fact, every protein that your body produces, the thousands of proteins that your body produces, digestive enzymes, hormones, every one of those proteins are produced as a result of your DNA. The DNA is the blueprint for the proteins. But yet proteins have to be present for DNA to be produced. So they both have to be in, I mean, that's powerful evidence for a creator. Both DNA and proteins had to be simultaneous. They had to be both present. When Adam and Eve and all the life was created, DNA was created with proteins originally. The origin of multicellular life, the origin of sexuality. With all life, there's a male and there's a female. Science, evolution doesn't explain that. Gaps in the fossil record. There's no trend, we don't see any half fish, half amphibians, or half reptile and half bird. Development of complex organ systems. You know what's really to it? Cell differentiation. You know, all of us, all living things started life when a sperm united with an egg. One cell, probably the size of the period on a letter you're reading, barely visible. One cell. When you become an adult, that one cell has become trillions, they say 40 to 50 trillion cells, and the cells are all specialized. There comes a time when that one cell, the sperm unites with the egg, it divided into 2, 4, 8, 16. There comes a time in the development of life that the cells start differentiating. Some become nerve cells, some become muscle cells, some become all the different types of cells that make up your body. Evolution has no answers for that. There's no explanation what causes that cell to start differentiating into the many different types of cells that make up life. And death. The Bible's very clear on death, what caused death. God told Adam and Eve, if you eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, death is going to be the result. Evolution cannot understand death. They can't explain it. Cobb County, Atlanta, outside of Atlanta, they had probably a strong creationist group in the county, and they wanted to put this sticker in all their biology textbooks. And this is what the sticker would say: this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. What a scientific statement. The court said that was unconstitutional to put in a book. You know, it's just like evolution is a sacred cow. You can't critique it. Even though there's so many untruths in the theory. In fact, even calling it a theory is, a scientific theory is usually something that's been tested and tried. It hasn't reached facthood yet, but it's something that can be tested and experimented on. But that is a sad commentary that could not be in a textbook. But that just shows you where we are today. And that brings us back, as we just kind of finish this brief look at both creation and then evolution, the Big Bang and the theory of evolution. Evolution can be taught in the public schools in South Carolina because it's science. Creation can't be taught because it's religion. And we have the separation of church and state. So teaching creation would be a terrible violation of the separation of church and state. It's real interesting. In 1961, the Supreme Court declared that evolution was a religion. Secular humanism, the main component of secular humanism is evolution, atheism. So what's really in reality happening, we can teach the religion of evolution, but we can't mention creation. Okay, let's look at some of the forms of intolerance and discrimination that are occurring today. Derogatory comments attacking the character and intelligence of anybody that believes in creation. I read an article where somebody had gone into a creationist's office and they'd put a picture of a pea and a human brain, and it was labeled, the pea was labeled the brain of a creationist, and then the regular brain, the brain of an evolutionist. Derogatory comments are, in fact, if you read this book, you'll get angry at what is directed at somebody that believes the Bible and believes that God is the creator. Denial of admittance to graduate school. This book records it. There are students that have been denied admittance to graduate school, and we'll talk about some cases. Denial of degrees. We'll talk about that. Denial of deserved promotions. Censorship. Firings and denial of tenure. Demotions. Threats and personal intimidation. Those are some of the things that are happening today. And here we're supposed to be living in the age of tolerance. We've got to be tolerant. The intolerance against a creationist is talk about something out of proportion. That is out of proportion. Let's look at some individual cases. George Mulfinger was a physics professor at Bob Jones University. He was denied his PhD degree at Columbia University. He was a summa cum laude student, straight A student, but he confided with a friend of his and that he was a creationist. He believed in creation. That friend went and told his advisor he was denied a degree at Columbia University. David Warner was a person who lived in Missouri, and he was talking about a doctoral candidate in the field of anthropology. He had a doctoral candidate. He was a missionary, and he had left the mission field and was trying to get into graduate school in anthropology. He was denied admission, and he was told that the university, when they questioned him, he was told that the university accepted no doctoral candidates who were not evolutionists. You know what they say, just to prove their point? No paleontologists are creationists. And that's because they won't accept creationists into the doctoral program for paleontology. Now again, there may be some exceptions. I'm sure that Bill Keith, his 12-year-old son, he lives in Louisiana, his 12-year-old son came home one day and just related how the teacher was talking about origins and had asked him how the world came into existence, and he said it was created. And then she gave him a second question, and he said, well, I believe it was created. She got mad at him and said, you give me another answer like that, I'm going to take you to the principal's office for discipline. Well, when he came home and told his father this, his father Bill and his mother, they were very concerned. And anyway, Bill Keith was an evolutionist. He actually said this. I was told in grammar school that evolution was true. I was told in high school it was true. I was told in college it was true. I thought it was true. So he started really looking into it. Today he's a creationist and a believer. But again, it just shows you the intolerance that is out there. Sharon Begley is a senior writer, science writer for the Boston Globe, and she was answering the questions, can a creationist be a good scientist, or can a good scientist be a creationist? And this was part of her writing. Mainstream researchers have answered with an emphatic no, because no one naive enough to believe the arguments of creationists could possibly do good science. How would you answer that? Dr. Werner von Braun, the German scientist who developed the rocket that put us on the moon, was a devout creationist. Dr. Damadian developed the MRI technology, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. He also was a devout creationist and devout believer. All of the early founders of science, I shouldn't say all, that's a dangerous term to use, but a good number of the founders of science. Louis Pasteur, we've talked about Sir Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, devout creationists. So certainly somebody should have called Sharon Begley and said, I beg to differ with you. Your piece here about can creationists be a good scientist, there have been many examples of creationists who were scientists that have really made sizable contributions to society. Skip was making me aware of a book tonight, Busting Myths, 30 PhD scientists who believe the Bible and its account of origins. CMI puts out the book, another good resource to have. So if anybody ever gives you the creationists or flat earth people, they deny science, that has a wealth of information that statement is totally false. This is a frightening. John W. Patterson is an engineering professor at Iowa State University. He is on record for saying this. The universities have a responsibility to expel creationists from the university, to deny degrees, even students with excellent grades, rescind degrees if a graduate becomes a creationist. I was just thinking, if that ever comes into effect, I could see Clemson University rescinding my degree. And a lot of people will say, oh, that will never happen. I'll tell you, in 1960, if somebody had said that the Supreme Court is going to say 2 men can marry or 2 women can marry and it's going to be legal, in 1960, 1950, people would have said that'll never happen. In fact, if somebody had said just probably 10 years ago that there's going to be a group that's going to say there are 17, 18 different genders, male and female are just 2 of the 18, we would have said, no way, Jose. If we don't do anything as believers, that will become reality. Maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe our kids and grandkids, that will happen. Roger D. Hart is a biology teacher, taught AP biology, chemistry at Burlington Edison High School in Washington State for 12 years, had an excellent record. He was an excellent teacher. He was a believer, but he never taught creation, never mentioned the Bible in his science classrooms. The only thing he did, he introduced challenges to evolution. We talked about the non-science things that deal with evolution, the things that evolution hasn't answered. Well, he gave his students, first of all, he showed them the movie Inherit the Wind, which was about the Scopes trial. And anyway, he got students thinking. And that's one of the things that, I know being a teacher, I can remember going to in-service programs, they said teach students to think critically. Don't just have them memorizing facts, get them teaching. Get them thinking critically. Well, that's what he did with respect to evolution. Well, one year, his 10th year teaching, one of his students that he didn't know, his parents, the student's parents were both lawyers with the ACLU. Well, 2 years later, Roger D. Hart left Burlington High School. Well, first of all, his superintendent and principal were very supportive. The school board was very supportive of him. And the superintendent and the principal retired. The new principal, the new superintendent, it was a different story. He came to school in the summer to get his new teaching position, and he was moved from biology to physical science. And the person who was going to be teaching biology was a PE certified PE teacher. Well, he saw the writing on the wall. He left. Now I think he taught at a Christian school in California for several years. Just think of that. In fact, when the issue just started, he had all kind of support. The students supported him 100%, except for that one student that went home and told mom and dad, who were ACLU lawyers. Ray Webster taught social studies, a 20-year veteran at Osterview Junior High School. He, again, wanted to just bring out and do a critique of evolution in social studies, in history. In fact, some court rulings have said you cannot do anything with the creation evolution issue in science classes. You have to do it in philosophy or religion classes or social studies classes. Well, anyway, this is what his superintendent said to him. He could not bring up Christian viewpoints on any social issues. He could not use any materials that advocated Christian interpretation of world events, history, government, or science. There was a suit involved, and the court ruling said this: students have no right to hear both sides of this controversial issue in the classroom, because creationism implies the existence of a creator, and it is unconstitutional to imply a creator's existence. I mean, that's happening in the United States of America. Dr. Raymond Damadian, we mentioned him a little while ago, he discovered MRI technology. If you've had an MRI, Dr. Raymond Damadian was the scientist that discovered the technology. President Reagan awarded him the National Medal of Technology. He did not get the Nobel Prize because he's a committed Christian. He believes in creation. And you know, I've just touched there are hundreds of cases. In fact, when I read this, my blood was boiling to see what's happening across our country with respect to this issue. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Militant atheists are redoubling their efforts to silence all those who would dare question or critique Darwinian evolution. And you know, the thing is, when you critique or question solid empirical science, it makes it better. I mean, if evolution was true, you know, critiquing it or questioning it is just going to make it stronger. Clear cases of academic disintegration and intolerance abound. If you just question or critique Darwinian evolution, the persecution will get into high gear. The third point, examining data published by professional societies, there are an average of about 400 cases of religious firings that occur annually in our colleges and universities. Here's looking at a magazine, World Magazine, I thought was Meet Your Son's first college professor. He is a militant atheist, Marxist English professor who eats Christian freshmen alive. And that ought to frighten every one of us that have grandkids or children going to public universities. There are a lot of people that fit that bill. Then let's look at what can be done. You know, first of all, we need to really be much in prayer. Corrie ten Boom, that awesome Christian that saved the lives of many Jews in Germany, she had a saying, is prayer your steering wheel or your spare tire? Unfortunately, a lot of Christians, prayer is our spare tire. When it's flat, we call on the Lord. We need prayer. We need to, every day before we get out for the day, we ought to pray. Ask God to give us the wisdom to make a difference, to change this. Look at what Scripture says. It was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that you should earnestly contend for the faith. Romans, hate what is evil. What can be more evil than teaching atheism? Giving atheism the ground that we give atheism today. Study. The Bible tells us, in fact, 1 Peter says, be ready always to give an answer. Study. The Bible tells us, commands us to study. When we first accept Christ into our life, we need to study. We need to mature and study. They say in the Scopes trial, Williams Jennings Bryan was defending creation. Clarence Darrow was defending evolution. Clarence Darrow asked William Jennings Bryan, and the Scopes trial was the Super Bowl of 1923. It was not just not America, it was all over the world the trial got publicity. Darrow asked William Jennings Bryan, where did Cain get his wife? And he couldn't answer that question. And the mockery continued. Being in the Gideons, I usually go to New York. Every year they have what is called the New York Bible Blitz. One year we went down to the World Trade Center during some free time, and I saw a sign down at the World Trade Center site, and this is what the sign said: God was asleep on 9/11. And it hit me. We need to answer. If somebody were to ask us, well, why did God let 9/11 occur? Yeah, those are tough questions that we need to be able to answer. We need to study, become knowledgeable and informed. And then we need to get involved, write letters to the editor, be proactive. Wouldn't it be great if every school board member got a copy with maybe a little cover letter, said, I'm real concerned that information is taught in our biology classes that say evolution is a fact and none of these questions are answered. Churches have really dropped the ball. Skip and I have tried to work with churches to get them to just do some creation programs, and they have been lukewarm. Now, some churches are great. Their doors are open and they realize it, but churches ought to be unified. You see the figure there, 91%. 91%, according to either Pew Research or Barna, I don't remember what it was, 91% of Christians do not have a biblical, accurate worldview. The 80% term is 80% of students, when they leave home, they leave the church. I talked to an assistant pastor at the church I was going to, and I said, how does that fit this church? He said, well, I don't know if it's 80%, but when kids graduate from high school, many of them leave. We don't see them anymore. You know, I have down there Christmas, Easter, and then creation. December, every church hits Christmas. If you go to any church in December, you're going to see the Christmas story. In Christmas, a Christian should not ever say, I don't know anything about Christmas and the birth of Christ. Easter, the same way. You know, I saw just recently that April 22nd every year is Earth Day, and most of the ceremonies are pagan. Wouldn't it be great if every church had an apologetics week every year to combat the 91% and the 80%? Give the major on how important apologetics. I mean, the Genesis 1:1, you could make a strong case. That's the most important verse in the Bible. And then support creation ministries financially. Here's Eugenie Scott, she's the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Look at some of her statements. You can't win this argument by scientific argument. Sure, when you look at 15 voids with respect to evolution, certainly you can't win the argument with science. You can win this argument by showing that evolution does not threaten religion. Our best allies were members of the mainstream clergy. The clergy went to the school board meetings and said evolution is okay with us. The idea that evolution is opposed to religion is a false dichotomy. That's another issue that we're dealing with. You know, again, there's bright lights. This scientist, I can't pronounce his name, but He's a chemist, physicist, recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry. The statistical probability that organic structures and the most precisely harmonized reactions that typify living organisms would be generated by accident is 0. Again, we see these commands in Scripture to be earnestly contending for the faith and to hate evil and to be ready always to give an answer. The danger of not getting involved. Cal Thomas stated years ago that secular humanism is not our greatest enemy. The greatest enemy is the apathy that is abundant today, especially among people of faith. Edmund Burke, our revolutionary hero, stated years ago, all that need happen for the forces of evil to triumph is that good men do nothing. Martin Luther King, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. You know, this picture to the left horrified the world. 18, I think they were Iraqi Christians that went to Syria to try to find employment, were told to renounce their faith or they would be executed. All 18 of them were executed. It horrified the Western world. This picture went viral. And we should have been horrified. That's just horrified. It is horrifying that we've got people in the world that would do something like this. When you look at this, though, from a scriptural standpoint, when we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. They say one of the 18 was not a believer, and when the ISIS people, the executioner, came to him, they said, "Are you going to renounce your faith?" This person said this: "I'm not a believer, but I want what these men have," and he was executed. But look at the right. Dr. William Provine, he died last year, in fact, just about a year ago. He was teaching at Cornell University, probably 250 students a year for 30 years. He probably was a real likable guy. Here's what he said: "Let me summarize my views on what modern biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed purposes of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no meaning for life, and no free will for humans either." Why isn't there the same outcry for this as there was for the actions of ISIS? We too should be voices.